When we broke for the lunch break, there were indications of some supplementary questions by the member from Georgetown. Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to be as brief as possible because I know we're trying to get on with the day. And I want to thank the Minister for the addition to her answer and give some clarification on the current state of play in respect to the morning routine. Can she say what is the evening routine? And then I'll follow up from there. Thank you.
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm reliably informed that the program known as the YMCA obtains for our primary and secondary institutions.
Member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister suggested that in some of the schools there were opportunities where persons were at the school compound up to as early as 6:45 a.m., but some others at 7:30. Obviously, this gives an advantage to the school that has an earlier time for those parents to drop off earlier. Is there any particular reason why some are at as early as 6:45 and others are at 7:30?
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, because of the demographics of Grand Cayman in particular and the working activity mainly being central around Georgetown and now to some extent Cayman Bay, those who live in the eastern districts have to leave at a much earlier time. So it just necessitates that some of them would have to leave their children like at Eastern Primary, Northside or Bordentown a little bit earlier. Fortunately, a lot of those persons in the eastern district still have that extended family unit. So they're able to supplement with that. And they also have vibrant and working PTAs that sponsor to pay for additional persons to be at ground. But while I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker, perhaps I ought to just put an invitation to treat that this lacuna in some particular areas, as we were seeing at the Georgetown High School, provides opportunity for a Caymanian to perhaps start a business, because in a way it's a diversification of a security type service. Just food for thought.
Member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And good response by the Minister helps clarify and highlight the issue of why I'm asking the question. The Minister also suggested that some PTAs get assistance from the ministry, indirectly or directly, I'm not sure. Thank you for the clarification, Minister. Two other questions and I'm finished, Mr. Speaker. The Minister also suggested that at some of those early starts, as early as 7:30, the first person to be there is a security guard. And then the teacher comes at a later date, and I think that the time was like 8 or 8:15. Is the security guards expected to be responsible? Is there an assumption that the security guards are responsible to the supervision if we're going to identify the 7:30 as a point where an adult is on the compound? Because the question then comes in, do these security guards have training necessary to deal with kids? And is there an assumption that that security guard is responsible for those children? Because I don't think that the companies that are hired have any expertise in that respect. The question came up as a result of meeting with some of the schools whose teachers were concerned about their contract obligations of when they're supposed to be there, because they come in earlier but can't define what time they actually start work compared to when they finish work. And I know that obviously a teacher's contract is not like the average contract where it has 8 o'clock and you get off at exactly at 5. But it creates a conflict when there are expectations that they're the supervisors early in the morning So I guess, are teachers supposed to be there that early when the start time and end time for them? And are these security guards supposed to be the ones who are supervisors that early? If we're identifying that time as an adult is being there, because there's a purpose why you highlight 7:30 security guard. There must be an assumption that we are comfortable with that security guard being able to supervise our children. And in many cases, we know that these security guards are persons who are making very minimum wage and have no skill sets whatsoever, and we don't even know them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I put the question that you can answer, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that all and sundry would agree that it's the sole responsibility of the parent to ensure the safety and the welfare of the child. Education under education law is mandatory, hence the reason we provide it to the extent that we do. But it's a tripartite relationship. It's between the parents, the government via the Ministry and Department of Education, and the private sector. The period of time that the Honourable Member from Georgetown Central is referring to is a period of time outside the regular time that's designated for learning and teaching of education. We have provided security. The need has been identified by the PTA, and I would send out a clarion call that all of the PTAs look into this as one of their priorities when they do their budgetary allocation and prioritization. Because it is true that there's a segment of our social stratification that would require some attention, but we must realize that the government cannot assist in every single capacity, and each of the tripartite vested interests must take responsibility. Hence the reason I threw out a bit earlier that it would be a good job opportunity for young and upcoming Caymanian, because then the government perhaps could look, as we've done with the preschools, and offer grants to those who meet the appropriate and relevant means tests.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have any.
Last supplementary, the member for Central Georgetown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have any other questions, but I just want to thank the Minister for giving the information necessary. Thank you.
Next question.
The elected member for Northside to ask the Honourable Acting Deputy Governor, ex officio member responsible for the portfolio of the Civil Service. Question number 14.
The Leader of the Opposition, the member for Georgetown. Sorry, Northside.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to ask the Honourable Acting Deputy Governor, ex officio member responsible for the portfolio of the Civil Service, the following question. Can the Honourable Acting Deputy Governor, ex officio member, explain what is the corruption threshold set by the Anti-Corruption Commission, how the threshold was established, and what sections of the law enables such a threshold?
The Honourable Acting Governor, Deputy Governor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Section 4, subsection 1C of the Anti-Corruption Law 2016 revision, the Anti-Corruption Commission has a duty to investigate any suspected offense, attempted offense, and any conspiracy to commit an offense under the law. Section 28, subsection 4 of the law requires the Commission to direct the carrying out of an investigation where it has reason to suspect the commission of an offense under the law following a report made under the law or information otherwise received by it. The duty of the Commission to investigate under both of the above stated sections of the law arises only if the Commission itself has reason to suspect an offense under the law has been committed. Thus, the threshold required by the law for an investigation by the Commission is that the Commission itself must have first have formed a reasonable suspicion that an offense under the law has been or is being committed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The elected member for Northside.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, Can the Honorable Deputy Governor confirm that the Anti-Corruption Commission carries out an internal investigation related to the complaint before it determines that it has not reached the threshold for them to investigate?
The Acting Deputy Governor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am advised that the Commission collectively makes a determination based upon the information available to it about whether or not the threshold has been met for the matter to proceed. I would suspect that the Commission, and again, I have to say, I'm not a member of the Commission, I'm not privy to their internal deliberations for obvious reasons, but the Commission has available to it the staffing resources and has the ability to review the information available and to make such inquiries as it deems necessary when making that determination. But I suspect that is done on a case-by-case basis based upon the nature of the complaint that has been submitted. You will members will note, based upon the annual report that has been tabled just today for the Anti-Corruption Commission, that there are various options available to it, which includes, in the case of the report that was tabled for the period 2016 to 2017, also the ability to transfer matters where it appears that by the nature of the complaint, that matter could be better disposed of by other investigative organizations. For example, if it's a matter of maladministration, to the Office of the Ombudsman, or for financial matters, also the ability to send that to the financial crimes unit. So they will make a determination based upon the information available, and if they deem necessary, additional information being sought. But it is important to note that the commission the membership of the commission constitutes 5 persons who, in the opinion of the governor, are of high integrity and are able to exercise competence, diligence, and sound judgment in fulfilling their responsibilities under the law. Members must be resident of these islands and may include retired judges of the Grand Court or the Court of Appeal, retired police officers, retired justices of the peace or magistrates, chartered or certified accountants, attorneys at law of 10 or more years, or retired attorneys at law, and other such persons as the governor considers qualified to be appointed. The membership requirements, therefore, Mr. Speaker, are quite considerable and hefty in terms of the qualifications and experience of persons who would need to make that assessment and determine the information that would be necessary for them to make that evaluation to begin with. And I have to say that the requirements are very ably met when you look at the persons who comprise that board, which includes a former Attorney General of these Cayman Islands, Mr. Richard Coles, a past member, Mr. Norman Bodden, who is himself, again, a managing director of Bodden Corporate Services, and a successful Caymanian businessman and past politician of these of the Legislative Assembly, Miss Sophia Ann Harris, the founder of the law firm, of a local law firm, Miss Katie Pentney Bodden, who is herself an accountant and certified public accountant, Mr. Tim Ridley, who is a senior partner, or was a senior partner for a major law firm and has served on numerous boards in these islands, and is an officer of the British Empire. And the most recent member that has been appointed, replacing Mr. Norman Bodens at the end of his tenure, would be Mr. Kenrick Hall, a former esteemed member of our Royal Cayman Islands Police Services, a retiree who has extensive experience and has been awarded the Colonial Police Medal, as well as the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, and I think is well known to our community, and retired at the rank of detective superintendent. So they have very capably qualified individuals who are able to make that determination as to the matters that are brought before it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The elected member for Northside.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, can the Honorable Acting Deputy Governor confirms whether the Commission relies on the quality of evidence filed by the complainant before making a decision? That is the only thing that is considered, since it does not appear that any investigation is done before the decision is made that it doesn't meet the threshold. Because I think the public needs to know that, because most people believe that if you make a complaint, they will look at the matter. But when you get a response saying it doesn't meet the threshold, the public needs to know, is the Commission expecting that the complainant is going to submit sufficient evidence to convince the Commission that it is worthy to be looked into?
The Honorable, the Acting Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, through you, I would just like to put the Honorable Leader of the Opposition's mind to ease on this as much as is possible. I have to reiterate, as I've been advised, that this is determined on a case-by-case basis, but what they are looking for is sufficient information that would allow them to determine whether there is a reasonable suspicion. It is very clear that the Commission is not expecting members of the public to make a full case that could lead to a prosecution, but at least to provide them with adequate information that would allow them to be able to reasonably, either with the information directly available or the information that can be reasonably accessed, to be able to determine if there is reasonable suspicion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Statements by honorable ministers and members of the cabinet.
The Honorable the Premier. The Honorable the Premier. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is almost impossible to turn on our computers or televisions these days without seeing some news story regarding immigration, including anti-immigrant sentiments expressed by politicians, nationalists, and people worried about job losses around the world. Cayman is no different in this respect, and increasingly, anti-immigrant sentiments are seen and heard on the talk shows, television, social media, and indeed wherever Caymanians gather. Mr. Speaker, as I wound up the budget debate in this Honourable House in November, I spoke about the benefit of immigration and the need for us to protect the rights of Caymanians. But I also warned against falling into the trap of xenophobia. I noted that Cayman owes much of what we have in development and opportunity to immigration. It was immigration and inward investment that allowed these islands and all of us to progress as we have done these past 50 years. But I also noted, Mr. Speaker, that immigration, like fire, is a good servant but a bad master. We must ensure that businesses have the workers they need to grow and prosper, and in so doing help Cayman and Caymanians prosper and thrive. But while we appreciate the benefits of immigration, we cannot ignore the local concerns regarding immigration, concerns that have challenged government after government ever since the Cayman Islands population first started to really grow. In the main, those concerns have been about jobs. In the early stages, those who inhabited these hallowed halls responded to the need for control of immigration and the economy by passing the work permit law in 1969. But as the number of work permits grew, so did the concerns, and by 1971, it was thought necessary to pass the Caymanian Protection Law and other related legislation like the Trade and Business Licensing Law, the Local Companies Control Law, etc. Following numerous amendments over the next 2 decades, the legislation was revised and modernized, and in 1992, the immigration law was passed, repealing the Caymanian Protection Law. In the ensuing years, there has probably been no other single piece of legislation in these islands that has been amended more times than the immigration law, mostly seeking to get a fair balance between employers having access to needed workers from overseas and ensuring that Caymanians are treated fairly and have opportunities for employment. But despite all these measures, Mr. Speaker, complaints of discrimination against Caymanians in the labor force remain widespread. As I have said, these are not new. However, the complaints and resentment are growing, and to date, no amount of change to the immigration law has alleviated the concerns. The stories about Caymanians being treated unfairly in the labor market are legion. Personally, hardly a day passes that I do not hear an anecdote of a Caymanian being discriminated against or treated unfairly with respect to employment. By being treated unfairly, I'm talking about qualified Caymanians who are able to do a particular job being unjustifiably refused an opportunity to work or being passed over for a training opportunity or promotion. Indeed, at times they may not even have received an opportunity for an interview for a job. In some cases, we know the stories firsthand, either through constituents, family, or friends, and so we know them to be true. That having been said, I acknowledge that not every complaint is valid. We also know the stories of the people that we have helped acquire a job, with employers giving them a chance, sometimes a second chance, only to find ourselves feeling disappointed when the individual leaves the employment without good reason, expecting the country or an elected member to bear the burden of their living costs. I mention this, Mr. Speaker, because we have to be honest with each other as Caymanians. But I want to focus today on those Caymanians who try hard to find and keep employment, and who come to us feeling let down because despite their experience and their qualifications, they feel shut out of the job market. Mr. Speaker, besides complaining about this issue publicly, all that successive generations of legislators have done is to keep tweaking the immigration law to fix one loophole or another so as to try to ensure fair opportunities for Caymanians. It is time, Mr. Speaker, it is time that we cease tinkering at the edges and accept that a fundamental change is necessary if we are to address this long-standing and growing issue of discrimination against Caymanians in the job market. In an economy that is expanding and that has as many work permits as ours does, it is simply unacceptable that a qualified and experienced Caymanian should not be able to find employment. My government is determined to fix this issue, which is threatening to undermine the social fabric of these beloved islands we call home. Mr. Speaker, one of the key measures we are taking is development of a human resources department whose remit will be to better regulate the labor market, including access to work permits. But this will not be enough. So we are also proposing to change the laws regarding the advertising of jobs, as well as implement a national jobs clearinghouse to improve the transparency and fairness of the labor market. But this too will not be enough. And I know that we will still hear complaints about discrimination. And so, Mr. Speaker, when we do hear them, what are we as elected members able to do? Should we simply resort to tweaking the immigration law and regulations yet again? I say no, Mr. Speaker. Successive governments have tried this approach over the last 45 years, and it has only led to an immigration law that has become even more complex and burdensome to manage. And even more attempts at increased enforcement of the immigration law will have limited success in alleviating the concerns of discrimination in the minds of Caymanians. There is a fine line between ensuring companies follow the law regarding the hiring of Caymanians and having an overbearing enforcement approach that discourages business. Incentivizing businesses to hire Caymanians has also been discussed for some time, but has never really gotten off the ground. However, this administration does intend during this year to dust this off and implement plans for what has been called the accreditation system that will seek to reward those businesses that do the right thing regarding the hiring and training of Caymanians. But, Mr. Speaker, this too will not resolve concerns of fair treatment. There is a need for an avenue for Caymanians to go when they have concerns regarding hiring practices. My government will address this vacuum by establishing Cayman's first Fair Employment Opportunities Commission. Employers and immigrants have access to an immigration appeals tribunal if they believe that a work permit or permanent residency application has been incorrectly refused. If you are employed and have a complaint against your employer, you have access to the Labor Appeals Tribunal. But if you are a Caymanian job seeker and believe that you were incorrectly treated when applying for a job or bypassed for a promotion, you have nowhere to go. The practice of writing a letter to the Immigration Board may sometimes result in the work permit application for a non-Caymanian being refused, but it rarely results in the complainant being given the job in question. Ironically, while many Caymanians look to the immigration law and department for protection against discrimination, the reality is that the immigration law does not, in fact, specifically address discrimination against Caymanians. There are no references to discrimination in the Immigration Law 2015 revision. Due to the lack of a legislative mandate for the Immigration Department, there is no official process for handling complaints of discrimination from job seekers or those seeking promotion. Hence, the department is frequently criticized for, quote, failing to protect Caymanians, unquote, and for, quote, failing to enforce the law, unquote. We hear those complaints everywhere, including in these chambers. Mr. Speaker, the Fair Employment Opportunities Commission, which we propose, with its legislative framework, will fill a gap that now exists. And Mr. Speaker, it is not just immigration law that is inadequate with regard to anti-discrimination provisions. Section 80, subsection 1 of the Labor Law 2011 revision states that, quote, no person, whether an employee or employer, may discriminate against another by reason of race, color, creed, sex, pregnancy, or any reason connected with pregnancy, age, mental, or physical disability, unquote. Penalty for doing so is a maximum of 12 months in prison and a $5,000 fine. Section 80, which consists of 135 words, does not apply to Caymanians per se and applies only to employees and employers. In other words, it excludes job applicants. Women, by contrast, have had extensive protection against workplace discrimination since the gender equality law was passed in 2011. Neither, Mr. Speaker, does the Labor Relations Bill in its current form significantly enhance protection against workplace discrimination for Caymanians. And finally, while the Bill of Rights contains protection against discrimination, this only applies vertically, that is, between individuals and government. Specific laws are required to apply the rights horizontally between individuals and other parties. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary, there is no current law to protect Caymanians from discrimination by employers, and no process by which Caymanians can officially complain or seek redress against instances of discrimination with respect to the job, the workplace, or the job market, to be more accurate. The Fair Employment Opportunities Commission would supplement other tools for ensuring the hiring of Caymanians while also providing Caymanians with the assurance that government and law-abiding employers do care about Caymanian employment. The Commission would also have the ability to sanction. Exactly what those sanctions involve will need to be decided, but would likely include administrative fines on businesses that are deemed to have hiring practices that are unfair to Caymanians. The Commission will be independent to avoid possible perceptions of bias toward business and must be able to maintain a balance and to apply the relevant aspects of the law. As such, Mr. Speaker, it would be headed by a commissioner appointed by the governor in a manner similar to the appointment of the Auditor General and Ombudsman. It is envisaged that the commissioner would be an experienced attorney or retired judge, and the office would be staffed by individuals with legal and investigative skills. Mr. Speaker, I hasten to say that this will not be some form of affirmative action commission, but it will be a commission that will consider the law and determine whether the complaint of unfair treatment is valid. It will be important that the business community and public do not believe that this body is subject to political interference, but instead operates independently and in accordance with the rule of law. In addition to providing Caymanians with an avenue to seek redress when they believe they've been treated unfairly, a Fair Employment Opportunity Commission will provide other benefits. Whilst there are Caymanians who believe that Caymanian job seekers are frequently discriminated against by employers, there is no data by which the government or the general public can correctly gauge the real extent of the problem, the effectiveness of existing legislative and enforcement efforts, or the impact of new measures to reduce this discrimination. The work of a Fair Employment Opportunity Commission would, over time, provide data regarding the occurrence of such incidents and what segments of the job market are more impacted by incidents of real or perceived discrimination. Mr. Speaker, there are also no proactive measures currently to prevent workplace discrimination against Caymanians. And there is also no campaign to educate Caymanians as to their employment rights and or what to do if they believe their rights have been violated. A Fair Employment Opportunities Commission would also perform these duties. Mr. Speaker, such a commission as we propose is not a unique idea. Indeed, many countries have similar commissions under names such as Equal Opportunity Commissions and Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions. So we are not proposing to implement something entirely novel. Mr. Speaker, it is our intention to consult widely with the business community with regards to the proposed Fair Employment Opportunity Commission. We also intend, as part of the exercise regarding the creation of a new Human Resources Department, that a new work permit regime operates efficiently and effectively without undue delays, providing a high level of service. As I said at the start, Mr. Speaker, this government recognizes the importance of business having access to quality, necessary personnel. But we also recognize that we need to do something new to ensure that Caymanians not only believe that they will be treated fairly in the job market, but where they do not so believe, that they have an avenue to take their grievances. If we do nothing and allow the current beliefs of unfairness to fester and grow, we may well end up where the Bahamas was in the 1970s, with an unsettled business climate and great resentment amongst local people, and with business leaving our shores. If properly set up, Mr. Speaker, within a legal framework and operated in an independent and fair manner, a Fair Employment Opportunity Commission can only be considered as something positive by Caymanians and by the business community. If a business is operating as the law requires and is treating Caymanian job applicants fairly, then they will have nothing to fear regarding the implementation of such a commission. Mr. Speaker, this is an important initiative and one I wanted to share with the Honourable House and the public at the earliest stage possible. We will move the initiative through the machinations of the government process, including consultations with stakeholders. And Mr. Speaker, the House can expect to hear more about this in the coming months. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Personal explanations.
Mr. Speaker.
Sorry.
Central Georgetown.
Mr. Speaker, forgive me again for my newness, but when a statement is made, we have a right to reply, am I correct?
No,
Right to ask?
you have a right to ask very short question.
If given permission by the chair.
You have a right to ask a short question.
Mr. Speaker.
The member for West Bay North.
Section 30, under Section 30, subsection 2, I would like to ask the Premier, very short question, with your permission, sir.
Permission granted?
Thank
You
you.
have that right.
Can Honorable Premier give this Honorable House the commitment that this commission will have more teeth than the one that is used in the civil service.
Honorable Premier,
Mr. Speaker, we are not at the point yet where the legislation is being drafted, but the draft legislation will be circulated and the subject of consultation with the broader community, including members of the House. And I think we can address whatever concerns that the member or others have about teeth when we come to that point.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chair, to the Premier.
Madam Clerk.
Personal explanations,
None.
obituary and other ceremonial speeches,
None.
raising of matter of privileges,
None.
other business, private member motions. Private member motion number 11 of 2017-18, mandate the post of the Cayman Islands Chief Fire Officer and Chief Immigration Officer as posts that can be filled by Caymanians, to be moved by the elected member for Georgetown Central.
The elected member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to bring to the floor of this honorable House private member's motion number 11, that's stated in my name, and it reads as such. Whereas it has been proven in the past that Caymanians can successfully run the Cayman Islands Fire Service in the post of Chief Fire Officer and the Immigration Department in the post of Chief Immigration Officer, and whereas many Caymanians believe these posts should be filled by Caymanians, be it therefore resolved that the Cayman Islands government consider immediately using the powers allowed by the Immigration Law 2015 revision under Section 46A to make the post of Cayman Islands Fire Chief Officer and Chief Immigration Officer posts that can only be occupied by Caymanians with no exceptions, and to carry out any other legislative changes that may be necessary to give effect to this policy objective.
Is there a seconder?
I beg to second the motion.
The question is that be it therefore resolved that the Cayman Islands government consider immediately using the powers allowed by the Immigration Law 2015 revision under Section 46A to make the post of the Cayman Islands Chief Fire Officer and the Chief Immigration Officer posts that can only be occupied by Caymanians with no exceptions, and to carry out any other legislative changes that may be necessary to give effect to this policy objective. The motion is open for debate. Does the member wish to speak thereto?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I start my debate, I want to say a great appreciation and thanks to the seconder of this motion. As a member of this honorable House, I quickly learned and understood the importance of having somebody there to support you. And we all know the politics of things, particularly us here in this honorable House, and I really respect and appreciate the honorable member and Deputy Speaker of this honorable House, MLA for West Bay North, Mr. Bernie Bush. Mr. Speaker, this motion, I don't think has any ambiguity in it. I think it's quite straightforward. I think that most of us here in this honorable House, Mr. Speaker, would agree that the sentiment around this country is that Caymanians want Caymanians in the high post in this country, in posts that make major decisions that affect our lives as Caymanians. I think, Mr. Speaker, we would definitely agree with that. I think there may be some controversy as soon as I sit down as to whether or not this government has the legality to do so, and I look forward to that discussion. But, Mr. Speaker, before they bring their arguments as to why, at least I am assuming that they will, hopefully I can be pleasantly surprised that they won't, but I assume that they will, before they bring their arguments as to why they're not going to do this, let's talk about the importance of why it needs to be done. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Premier just got up and gave an amazing speech that set the tone of employment in the Cayman Islands. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, it's a rather accurate tone of what it's like for employment. And this is no different than it is for members who are employed by the civil service. And in the civil service is where much of the major decisions that affect our lives are made. Now, Mr. Speaker, every country that I'm aware of has some form of regulation, policy, legislation, or cultural norms to make sure that the people of that nation are in control of those types of positions that major decisions are made in that affect the lives of the people within that nation. Mr. Speaker, we have yet to do so except within this honorable House and for the honorable post and position of the Deputy Governor. Mr. Speaker, a former member of this Parliament, I'm not aware if I'm allowed to say his name, but I suspect I can because he's no longer a member of Parliament. Can I? Mr. Speaker, am I allowed to use by name former members of Parliament? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A former member of Parliament, I'm not sure if he's supposed to be called honorable, but I'll call him honorable. The Honorable Elio Solomon tried to bring a motion.
And then you need correct. I want about how the deputy governor became Cayman. You need to deal with that. I was too attack, push us in doing that.
Mr. Speaker,
You remember that.
the former member of this House, Mr. Elio Solomon, brought a motion to this House in the administration of 2009 to 2013. And in this honorable House, on March the 25th of 2013, legislation was passed to give the authority to the Cabinet to make decisions on serious posts and jobs and different trades to allow it to be Caymanian. And at that particular time, Mr. Speaker, and I have the Hansards here with me, Mr. Speaker, and I read as much of it I could digest. Most of the sentiment was the attitude of how it was protecting Caymanians, and this legislation would give certainty to Caymanians in certain jobs. But, Mr. Speaker, as we are aware, we haven't taken the opportunity at this particular point to use the authority at all. And there could be justified reasoning behind that based on the fact that the post, before government can make a decision on selecting any trade or occupation to be Caymanian only, there needs to be much research, and I agree with that. But, Mr. Speaker, today what we're talking about is not a trade where there's many of those persons. We're talking about particular posts. And the research that would be necessary to make a decision like that, I don't think is necessary in this particular situation. We're talking about positions where Caymanians have done very well, have created departments, ran them very well for centuries, and have proven that they can do the job. So I don't think much of the discussion about what happened in the Hansards back on the 25th of March 2013 may be relevant, only but to say, and I'll come back to that, I'm not going to use that ace in the hole quite yet. This is a debate. Well, it could be a jack, I'm not sure if it's an ace, but I'm hoping that it's an ace. Mr. Speaker, this motion is more than just protecting the post of fire chief and the immigration chief. This motion is about giving Caymanians the feel that we are willing to do what it takes to protect the culture and norms of what we stand for. Because when you are in a major decision-making position in this country, based on how you are as an individual, regardless of whether you like it or not, your attitude, your culture, your background, your history is reflected in your decision-making processes. The fact that you may have been raised in a Christian background will affect the way you think, the way you come to conclusions. And I think, Mr. Speaker, some may actually say that's the reason why that our culture and our heritage is dwindling so much, because so many people in the position of decision making and affecting our lives today are not Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, if we do not start from now, from today, to start to make the decisions on protecting these types of positions that affect our lives, and I dare say, Mr. Speaker, there's only 2 before the House, but I suspect in the future there will be a whole lot more coming to this honorable House. If we do not start to protect these types of positions, the same thing that the Premier spoke about in his speech earlier, about an attitude towards the business community, an attitude amongst our country of divide, will continue to fester and eventually affect our economy. Affect our economy in not a positive way either, Mr. Speaker. Caymanians are starting to feel more and more every day that they despise expats. And sometimes you ask yourself the question, do they have a right to feel that way? Regardless of whether they have a right to feel that way, Mr. Speaker, we know it's not healthy for the longevity of our nation. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, passing a motion of this nature can only help calm the nerves of Caymanians that we will do what it takes to protect particular posts that affect the culture and heritage and behavior and norms of our country. Now, Mr. Speaker, when I say that, I'm quite sure somebody's going to say, well, how does the fire department affect the behavior of our community? I don't think anybody would ever ask about the immigration department, because I believe even the children in Africa agree that the head of the immigration department should be a Caymanian. I wait to hear the responses on that one. But, Mr. Speaker, I think most of us have heard much of the talks and the conversations about the past chief officer, the chief fire officer, Mr. Kirkland Nixon, and the pride that he brought to that department. And I can speak from an informed position, Mr. Speaker, because I was a fireman and I was under him. He hired me as a 17-year-old boy fresh out of school. And what it delivered to many young men at that age was, boy, I don't know how the job market gonna go, but I know one thing, I can always be a fireman because I'm a Caymanian. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in my lifetime that I'm aware of, which happened in the last administration, a non-Caymanian ran the fire department, even when there was indications that it would never happen underneath my watch. A non-Caymanian headed up that department. So, Mr. Speaker, if that can happen, how much longer will it be before the whole department will have non-Caymanians in it? Anyway, Mr. Speaker, the law does not, at this particular stage, no law protects or allows civil servants or the civil service to mandate only Caymanians being in the fire department. So at this particular point, it's just a cultural behavior, which thank God is still happening. And I would encourage whoever is in charge of that department to continue that culture for the protection of our nationalistic, our national atmosphere and our pride. Because if that starts to change, that's going to add to what the Premier just talked about in respect to his, the country's animosity to foreigners. Mr. Speaker, much of what I want to add to this motion will definitely come after my closing remarks, because I must agree we are in politics, and there's going to be strategies on who wins this debate and who doesn't win it. Even though, Mr. Speaker, I wish I didn't get into the games of things, but we have to. I had to learn quickly. So I am not going to get, I'm going to try to use about another 15 minutes and then give the members of this honorable House an opportunity to give their contributions. But I want to talk about one particular question that I constantly hear, which is, shouldn't these posts, and I say these, the ones that are currently before the House, be open to the best available talent, even if that means looking outside of the Cayman Islands? I would agree, Mr. Speaker, everybody wants the best person there, because that means we're getting the best. But, Mr. Speaker, I ask, at what expense? We currently have a labor market, Mr. Speaker, that is expected to compete against the rest of the world. That means the smartest, the brightest, the Harvards, all the big universities in London and New York, we're expected to compete against them with no level of protection whatsoever. And then we admit every single election about the failures in our education system and the failures in our succession planning. But yet still, we expect them to compete against the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, I do not think that's a fair environment to put those who want to succeed in the Cayman Islands in. I think it's a disservice, to be honest with you, Mr. Speaker, that we've put them, I mean, at the end of the day, we are a growing society. We're globalized now, and the world is practically flat again, no longer round, because of the world of technology. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to figure out a way to balance the fact that we're so modern and so globalized, at the same time protecting the interests of Caymanians in senior posts in this country. Because if not, unless Cayman is prepared to make the best there is in the world in every single post, there will always forever be an excuse that there's somebody else better from somewhere else to do that job. Hence the reason I had to bring the motion, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of former member of the elected House, Mr. Elias Solomon, he said on the radio the other day, and it's a strong point, if the Constitution did not protect the position as Deputy Governor, would there have been some reason found for somebody from the UK to be in that post? That's what I would like to ask the public. I know they would have come up with some reason why the Honorable Franz Manderson couldn't do the job. But proper succession planning, identifying individuals from early, making sure they had the necessary training and exposure and experience, allowed Mr. Franz Manderson to be, and I dare say today, the best deputy governor that I'm aware of. So I give him that congratulations here today. But whoever was in charge of that succession planning obviously have not done the exact same thing across the civil service. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that I take the opportunity to highlight the fact that I was presented, or all members of the opposition was presented by the now acting Deputy Governor with plans by the civil service for proper succession planning. And I was happy. I'm glad to hear about that. But they too have limitations. And Mr. Speaker, it is hard to train Caymanians when the budget is not there for them to be trained. Mr. Speaker, if we make it mandatory for certain positions in this country to be Caymanian only, then this Honorable House will have to make it mandatory to find the finances to train them and give them the exposure necessary. In the downturn in the economy in the just past half a decade ago, most of the budget cuts went to training. Maybe that's why we don't have a fire chief today. But this bill, Mr. Speaker, is really about forcing us to do what is right. Because for those out there who are saying, well, boy, if you mandate it that it's a Caymanian, you might end up putting a Caymanian who is not prepared. That might be true for the medium term. But when we realize that we have no other obligation but to put a Caymanian there, maybe it would force us as legislators and future legislators to say, listen, boy, you know, that head officer ain't doing it. We need to find a good Caymanian from now, give them the money that's necessary, put them off, send them off on, what is it called? Secondment. Forgive me, Mr. Speaker. Secondment to make sure they have the experience. Because until we are pressured to make sure that there's a Caymanian, we'll forever be going, oh yeah, we can deal with it tomorrow. Oh, we can deal with it next year. While the foreigners, they're in those positions, every single time they get a post in a high position, within 2 to 6 months, they have somebody else that they're friends with right below them. And unless you want me to list out, and I can do that in my rebuttal, how many situations we've had with that, while we're sitting down saying we're going to train Caymanians, they're setting up themselves and their friends. And when they are making big decisions about us as Caymanians, their cultures, their behaviors, their norms are coming out in those decisions that are affecting Cayman and changing who we are as a people. That's why it's important today for this motion to be passed, Mr. Speaker. Not because just only the fire chief should be fire chief, not because the immigration chief officer should be a Caymanian, because it goes down to the morale of who we are and protecting the culture of who we are as a people. So again, to answer the question that was posed to me when I started the discussion about this, well, what if the best available talent isn't from Cayman and we need the best available talent? I dare say the expense that comes along with the best available talent across the world isn't worth losing Cayman and its identity. Because that's what we do. When we decide to say, oh, the man from England, the man from Canada, the man from America is a little more qualified than the Caymanian, but does he know who we are? Does he know what we stand for? Does he have the respect? Will he come out if he drive away and see a kid passing and let the kid pass? Is that a part of his culture? Or his job is to get up every day, make sure he's time to work and get everything done and don't think about anybody else other than himself? Because that's how they were trained. They came off of conveyor belts. Don't care about anything else. It's all about the corporate world or the civil service world. We are still a very small nation that have these little small elements about us that make us unique. And no matter how much qualifications that they have and experience that they have, they cannot bring that to the position, Mr. Speaker. I think we would all agree that if the best persons qualified for every post were Caymanian, there were, let's say for instance, Mr. Speaker, for argument's sake, there was a school, a world university for fire officers, and our Caymanian went off and came top of the class. We'll feel good. We say, we got the smartest there is in the world, and the fact he has the cultural norms of who we are. That's the perfect scenario. Well, this motion, Mr. Speaker, is mandating that we do that. Because when we mandate it to be Caymanian only, it's going to force us as legislators, as well as the government, who are the protectors of the taxpayers' money, to spend that money to make sure that those individuals are the best. Maybe then we will start identifying young people from when they're in schools and say, that will be the next deputy governor, that will be the next chief immigration officer, that will be the next customs head. That's what this motion is about, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to be very mindful about the time because I'm a newbie and time can run fast when you're talking plenty. So forgive me if I continue to look up at the clock. Mr. Speaker, another question that was asked by me in respect to this motion is, why only these two posts and why not any others? And I think I touched a little bit on that earlier, Mr. Speaker, but let me reiterate. I must admit, there is a level of politics here. And to be frank, Mr. Speaker, and the Cayman public, I would like to see every post in this country be Caymanian only, but this is the only tool that I think the members of this government and us as members in opposition will have a very difficult time telling the Caymanian people why you didn't support this motion. So yes, there's a little bit of politics in particular with these two posts. I think they may get away a little bit with the fire post because I understand that we're having some difficulties over there. But nothing that a little bit of delay in this motion for maybe another year or so, but make it pass still, can't fix. So I'm waiting to hear their reasoning behind that. Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage the members to think, because I know that the politics of things are going to play, and the government have probably already made up their minds as how to vote. Because they're not going to pause and then go off and consider what I've said. They've already considered it, Mr. Speaker. They've already had a caucus meeting. They've already had the little chitter-chatters, which I appreciate. At least I'm being considered. At least the motion is being considered. But I suspect that that consideration is already to say no to this motion. But I want you to consider something. When you say no, if you do intend to say no, what message are you sending to the people of this country when you are not prepared to say yes, that we believe a Caymanian should and will be forever moving forward, be a Caymanian as a fire chief and as a chief immigration officer? What are you telling the Caymanian people? Here's what you're telling them. You're saying, no, you do not believe in Caymanians. You're saying that you are happy to be led by non-Caymanians. You're saying that you're buying into the crab in a bucket mentality by not wanting to see other Caymanians do well. You are hurting the morale of the national pride in this country to lead ourselves. And you are adding to the continuance of the decay of our culture and who we are by not agreeing to put Caymanians in serious posts that make decisions on our lives. And when you do that, you hurt Cayman. So I want each and every member to think about that. There's going to be hurdles. I know there's going to be hurdles. It's not an exact science, and there are civil servants out there who need help to be a little bit better. But you know what? Let's get behind them, help them, fix them, give them whatever they need to do the job better. Don't say they're not prepared. Mr. Speaker, you might have heard me ask the Premier to give indications to a timeline on a question I asked him about earlier. Because if we do not give ourselves limits and obligations by law, we never get them done. I think this motion will help us with that. Mr. Speaker, the question, forgive me, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, about the protocol of this, but what I have in my hand here, Mr. Speaker, is a document that is a old job description of the Cayman Islands Fire Chief. And Mr. Speaker, anything I say move.
If the member intends to read the document, I would need a copy of it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or if you intend to read from the document.
Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to read from it, but just to refer from my memory what's in it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If it goes too deep into it, I'm going to require a receipt, because I don't want you to be holding, just to say, I don't want you to be holding a document clean to be referring to it, not reading from it, but referring to it. I still don't know what you're referring to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to be on the safe side, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to hand the document to the Sarge for copies. And I don't, Mr. Speaker, maybe it'd be prudent to give a copy to the Honorable Opposition Leader and to the Honorable Premier.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would prefer to lay it on the table of the House.
If the speaker want a copy, that is the correct use. If you're doing something wrong, give the speaker a copy. They don't need yours. But if you leave, then you gotta get copies.
Get a copy, and then he can get what he wants to do.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to deal with another matter until he comes back. Mr. Speaker, the document the Sarge is going to copy talks about the, and I'm speaking generally until I get it, right? Talks about the role of the chief officer, of the fire chief. And I bring that up because in that role is much of the roles and responsibilities have to do with administrative or leadership skills. And I'm going to identify to you, Mr. Speaker, out of the job description, that 65% of it has to do with leadership and administrative work. The other 35% of that job description, Mr. Speaker, has to do with the science and experience element of being a fire chief. And Mr. Speaker, in that document, it also speaks about how many deputies it has. It has 3 deputy fire chiefs. And 2 of those deputies, Mr. Speaker, have to have fire experience background in order to advise the chief fire officer. And the other deputy fire chief is an administrative role which doesn't have to have mandatory fire experience. Now you ask, Mr. Speaker, you may ask, well, why is that relevant? It's relevant because I am going to propose that because 65% of that role has to do with administration and leadership, and from all indications given to me, that seems to be the biggest problem there at the department now. That cannot a person that is able to do the administrative leadership skills and the leadership and administrative skills be seconded to the head of the fire department, while the other 2 deputies who are obligated to have the fire education and experience be there to advise on the other 35% of those job responsibilities. Now, there may be some technicalities to why that can't work. But the concept behind it, Mr. Speaker, for me, is we've seen a recent example of when we didn't have somebody ready for the post, that we seconded Miss Samantha Bennett. Mr. Speaker, please forgive me, but am I allowed to refer to persons by name that work in official positions in civil service? Post? Okay.
More appropriate to do it by post.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that.
And, honorable member, remember, there are limits to what, and I'm only saying this for your edification, and the other members can close their ears. There is a limit to what can be done because an elected person is not in charge of the civil service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I fear that you're getting involved in this debate.
Involved as I might be, I'm doing it for your good.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that. I hear the ums and ahs, but I know that that's going to be a part of the government's position, and I will deal with that accordingly. Hence the reason I suggested what I suggested, but please forgive me, Mr. Speaker. And before we went off track there, I was speaking about the post of customs head of collectors of the head of customs, and we had a vacancy there. And in the previous administration, under the civil service, there was a secondment from the immigration department where I believe, Mr. Speaker, a deputy chief immigration officer was seconded to head up the customs department for a short period of time until a very well qualified and strong leader was identified, who I dare say I am very proud of today. And then that deputy immigration officer was then sent back to her post at the immigration department. Now, I brought that to connect to the relevance of the job description. And I was speaking to you before, my theory, and again, I admit that there might be some complications to this, and I know the acting deputy governor is listening, but my theory was that if you see, Mr. Speaker, on page 4, the chart in the fire department, where there's a chief fire officer, then there's a deputy chief fire officer for airdrome department, then there's a deputy chief fire officer for domestic, and then there's a deputy chief fire officer for administration. So we have somebody there to help in the 3 main areas of the responsibilities of the chief. Now, Mr. Speaker, I was referring before to the 65% of that role being administrative and leadership. And if anybody would like to, for those who have a copy of it, you can see that there is 12 different topics upon which the principal accountabilities of the chief fire officer will be. And just based on two different categories, one being fire education and experience, and the other being leadership and administration, fire education and experience, only 35% of these principal accountabilities would fall in that category, and the other 65% of administrative and leadership would fall, only about 65% would fall in that category. So my theory was, why couldn't there be somebody seconded who is a Caymanian, and I got to get back to the principle of this, Mr. Speaker, who is a Caymanian to temporarily, until we find somebody who can merge both of those elements together, which is the experience and education behind fire, along with the leadership and administrative together to make the whole of the fire chief that we see on page 4 of the chart, of the organizational chart. These types of strategies, Mr. Speaker, need to be taken in order to protect the Caymanian lives, because you need to take unorthodox moves to ensure that you continue the little bit of culture that we still have left by way of culture of life. And when we say culture, I don't mean like banging drums. Culture can be a norm of a department. Culture can be, how do we keep our Christian heritage? It could be the way I walk down the road. It's a human behavior, a human habit of a group of people. That's what we're protecting, Mr. Speaker. And with the global market changing, and we are being so global and open with our immigration policies and hiring practices, we are changing who we are as a people. So it takes little strategies like what I've suggested just now to keep protecting us. And it takes strategies like this motion to force us to pull our pants up, put the money where it's necessary to train Caymanians to be in these posts. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me wrap up, because I'm excited to go into the next round, which I suspect is going to be interesting. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this as I listen ever so carefully to what other members of this Honorable House will have to say in respect to this motion. But before we say anything else, I think it's important that every member of this House understand the magnitude of what you say in respect to the national picture of who we are and what is happening with the protection of us as Caymanians, because this motion goes further than just the immigration head and the chief fire officer's head. It talks more than that. So I encourage to be mindful, because we're talking about changing the hearts and the feel of the people, of whether their nationalistic attitude of feeling proud to be Caymanian. This bill is about that. Even if you want to disagree, Mr. Speaker, be cautious on how you do it, because you can kill the spirit of the people if you're not mindful how you do that. And I'll say this, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to sound, I hope I don't come off cocky, but I'm going to do my job to call out anybody who comes up with any nonsense as why Caymanians cannot be in these positions. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, I'll sit and wait carefully to what has to be added to this contribution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Acting Deputy Governor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to add my contributions to the debate on the private member's motion to mandate the positions of the Cayman Islands Chief Fire Officer and Chief Immigration Officer be posts that can only be filled by Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, it is a good feeling to be able to add my voice to what I believe is a unanimous aspiration of all those who sit in this honorable House, whether elected or who hold ex officio roles. We are all unified in our desire and commitment to ensure maximum Caymanian participation within the civil service, and in particular within its leadership roles. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, we have a solid track record of achieving just this outcome. Across the civil service, some 74% of positions are filled by Caymanians. And in the two departments in question, the participation of Caymanians is highly demonstrated, with immigration having 99.4% participation of Caymanians, and with the fire department having 98.5% Caymanian staff complement. So to be clear, that which unites us in aspiration, maximizing Caymanian participation within our civil service, is being largely delivered within our civil service, and in particular within the two uniform departments under discussion today. Mr. Speaker, where I hope we will continue to be unified in our aspirations is to insist that any person who holds a position within our civil service generally, but more specifically in the leadership of public safety and national security agencies, be suitably qualified and experienced to carry out their mandates. Why are these qualifiers so important? Why do the heads of these organizations need to be suitably qualified and experienced? Mr. Speaker, the member from Georgetown Central had a great deal of discussion about the need for us to be protecting positions. I respectfully submit, Mr. Speaker, that this may be putting the emphasis on the wrong subject matter. The protection we owe, Mr. Speaker, is to our citizens and to the securing our borders. We must protect the opportunity for Caymanians to hold positions of leadership in our civil service. And we need to recruit, train, and promote qualified persons to hold these very important roles. So, Mr. Speaker, the protection that we ultimately owe, as our purpose statement will refer to within our 5-year strategic plan for the civil service, is to make sure that we are improving the lives of those we serve. And in such important roles involving safety and security, this can never be more important of a mandate. These, as the honorable member from Georgetown Central has referenced, in particular the fire position role, and I know that he has, I understand, tabled the job description for the chief fire officer role? So I would just say, sir, that the very document relied upon by the member from Georgetown Central speaks to the fact that this is a very large role. This is a role that is responsible for some 168 personnel, an annual budget of $11.5 million, providing emergency services to 3 airports, and the control of 5 active fire stations, including our domestic fire and rescue services across our 3 islands. And being able to control and maintain our significant equipment and facilities that are charged to that department. And above all else, maintaining the safety of individuals in these islands, including those who have the privilege, such as ourselves, to call the Cayman Islands our home, and the many who visit our shores. A very, very important mandate. So, As I have alluded, Mr. Speaker, these roles are critical to the safety and security of our islands. Moreover, we owe it to the men and women who are our first responders to ensure they are under capable leadership, which keeps them safe. We owe it to all of our employees to ensure that they have good leadership, even the best leadership, given the responsibility of senior leaders to mentor and shape future leaders. The private member's motion before us calls for legislative action to mandate that these two roles are filled by Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, our commitment to maximizing the participation of Caymanians within our civil service. Yes, sir.
Honorable member, Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
The question is that Standing Order 10-2 be suspended to enable the business of the House to continue beyond the hour of 4:30. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The noes have it.
That's wrong.
Mr. Speaker, can I have a division?
Honorable members, I heard more no's. Yes, but the no is not voted on yet. The vote not taken, I heard it, but I haven't declared it. What does I'm in your hands as sure as the House is in your hands? Please, can I have the division?
Honorable Alan McLaughlin.
Aye.
Honorable Moses Kirkconnell.
Aye.
Honorable Juliana O'Connor Connolly.
Aye.
Honorable Dwayne Seymour. Honorable Roy McTaggart.
Aye.
Honorable Joseph Hugh. Honorable Tara Rivers. Honorable Barney Bush. Captain Eugene Ebanks. Mr. David White. Ms. Barbara Connolly.
Aye.
Mr. Austin Harris.
Aye.
Honorable Ezra Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Anthony Eden. Mr. Christopher Saunders.
Aye.
Mr. Ord McLean.
Aye.
I heard a no coming from you, though. It's unparliamentary in the House. That's why I know it's unparliamentary. The ayes in the division, 14, absent members, 4. The motion is carried. The House continues. Honorable Deputy, Acting Deputy Governor. Not once.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't sure what was happening there and exactly how that would reflect on my own performance assessment. Mr. Speaker, the private member's motion before us calls for legislative action to mandate that these two roles are filled by Caymanians. Mr. Speaker, our commitment to maximizing the participation of Caymanians within our civil service is already supported by a legal mandate. The legislation which is applicable in this instance, Mr. Speaker, is not the immigration law to which the motion alludes, but rather the public service management law. Mr. Speaker, we have an overarching responsibility within the civil service to ensure, first and foremost, we appoint the right people with the right qualifications to civil service positions. The totality of qualifications, skills, knowledge, and experience a candidate brings to the table are the determining factors in an appointment decision. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, it is right to ensure that suitably qualified Caymanians are given every opportunity and even a preference in filling these roles. And we already have legislation, the Public Service Management Law, that does just this. The PSML and personnel regulations currently provide an enabling mechanism for Caymanians found to have broadly comparable factors to be given preference for civil service roles. The PSML, Section 41, subsection 7, states, but where after applying the criteria, two or more persons ranked broadly at the same level, Caymanians shall be given preference. The underpinning personnel regulation, Section 26, provides that when in compiling the short list under Section 41, subsection 6 of the law, a Caymanian and non-Caymanian are found to rank broadly at the same level, the Caymanian shall be given preference. And Public Service Management Law, Section 41, subsection 7b, provides that the interview panel to establish the preferred candidate can consider the personal knowledge of the person on the interview panel as declared to the panel. This allows for the known competencies of the local candidates to be considered in the process. Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to speak to the specifics of each position mentioned in this proposal in turn, because the situation is not the same in both cases. Firstly, as it relates to the role of the Chief Immigration Officer, do we need to mandate that a Caymanian fill this position? Mr. Speaker, to my recollection, the only time this position was held by a non-Caymanian in recent history was for a short interim period to facilitate succession planning for Mr. Manderson, the then Chief Immigration Officer designate, and today our current Deputy Governor. And, Mr. Speaker, even with all of the recent challenges at the Immigration Department, we have been able to find Caymanian talent within the organization and to maintain the critical work of this department. And we've also been able to attract Caymanian talent outside of the civil service while the government pursues a strategic reorganization of the labor and immigration regime. It is expected that the role of Chief Immigration Officer will evolve in scope and responsibility over the course of the next 12 to 18 months as a result of strategic reorganization to create the Human Resources Department. When this work is complete and the roles of leadership positions in the organization are defined, we remain optimistic that we will be able to find suitable Caymanian talent to fill these positions. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is in that vein that I would like to highlight the recent interim appointment of Ms. Sharon Rolston as the interim director of the new Human Resources Department, which is under development. The fact that we are able to recruit a highly qualified Caymanian to this position demonstrates our collective determination to find Caymanian talent for critical positions and to be flexible in how we source Caymanian talent to meet our objective, even when this means recruiting from outside the civil service. What we do not compromise on, that while we might demonstrate flexibility in the ways that we source Caymanian talent, we insist and maintain the need for persons to come with the qualifications to meet the demands of that role. Mr. Speaker, this example is not an exception. We have continued to make great strides in filling senior roles within the civil service with qualified and experienced staff, mostly by internal promotions, I would add, For example, in the 2016-17 financial year, we had 3 deputy chief officer roles that were filled by Caymanians, including Ms. Tammy Ebanks, Titania Cacho, and Ms. Dolores Gordon. We had the Director of Education Services filled by Ms. Lynette Monteith, and a Deputy Chief Advisor role filled by Dr. Tasha Ebanks Garcia, and other senior positions including the Clerk of Courts by Ms. Shiona Allinger, 2 Deputy Collectors of Customs by Mr. Jeff Jackson and Kevin Walton, Deputy Commissioner of Police by Kurt Walton, Chief Internal Communication Officer by Audrey Bodden, Deputy Director of Community Rehabilitation by Lisa Malice, and the CFO within the Ministry of Community Affairs by Mr. Joel Burke. Recently, we were pleased to announce the appointment of our newest chief officer, Ms. Teresa Echeniki, to the Ministry of Community Affairs. So, Mr. Speaker, all 13 of these senior level roles have been filled by highly accomplished Caymanians, continuing in that tradition. And I would like to speak about the roles of the chief fire officer, where there is currently a non-Caymanian serving in the post, as we realize there has been a lot of debate about why this is the case. The fact is, prior to making the current appointment, the ministry responsible for fire services conducted 3 recruitment exercises. In the first 2 recruitment exercises, the decision to not hire a Caymanian within the fire service had to do with the fact that the candidates putting themselves forward scored low in the testing and interviews, whilst others did not meet the minimum requirements of the post. Mr. Speaker, it should be acknowledged that a contributing factor is the depth and breadth of firefighting experience and other experience necessary for the chief fire officer role, which is in turn necessary to continue to lead our firefighters to meet the regulatory standards necessary to preserve life and also to maintain our, for example, our Category 1 aviation regulatory status of these islands for our aerodrome services. So the pressures to respond to increasingly complex technical demands presented by our higher density and larger physical properties and other developments within these islands means that this role and the function of this service is only becoming more complex, not just from a leadership perspective, but equally a technical perspective. And as a result, the pool of applicants from which the role can pull is narrow and resides within the fire department itself or similar fire services. Mr. Speaker, it should not be forgotten that, like immigration, the fire service has a history of distinguished Caymanian leaders, which has been recognized, and we like to recognize that this dates back to the 1970s when we had Mr. Kirkland Nixon appointed as the fire chief, and that tradition continued with Mr. Roy Grant and Mr. Denham Bodden. And we should also state that while there was succession planning in place, there was clearly a breakdown that occurred with these gentlemen being in very close retirement age of one another. So in very quick succession, you went through 3 Caymanian chief fire officers. So why has it been so difficult to find a qualified Caymanian for the position of chief fire officer to continue this proud tradition? To begin with, we have to acknowledge that over the medium term, there is a significant gap in the succession planning within our services, and most pronouncedly within that department. The 3 leaders in question, as I've said, were relatively close in age, and therefore the immediate successors exited the organization within short periods of time of each other, either through normal retirement or, in the case of some, through medical retirement. And not enough had been done to prepare potential successors from the lower ranks. We acknowledge that. This situation, however, Mr. Speaker, it's not a static situation. While there is no quick fix, there is much that can be done and is being done to correct the situation. Mr. Speaker, I am advised by the Ministry of Financial Services and Home Affairs that ongoing training and development for staff at all levels is a priority. To this end, between December 2015 and December 2017, the Fire Services has invested $175,000 in training for more than 60 staff in areas such as incident command, apparatus operations, strategic emergency and crisis management, and fire prevention. In addition, opportunities for leadership-focused training were provided through the annual IPAC Leadership Conference, the Cayman Islands Society for Human Resources Professionals Conference, leading to improving HR management capabilities, and the International Association Fire Chiefs Conference. Special focus has been placed on cross-training for staff between the aerodrome and domestic divisions in order to expand the skill sets of staff and to improve the capacity of the service to respond to emergency incidents. In addition, staff have been invited to join working groups and to take part in various initiatives that would build their management acumen, like the procurement team that was responsible for the purchase of the new rescue launch in 2017, which provided a hands-on opportunity to apply government's procurement policy and become familiar with government's procurement systems. Per the recommendations of the recently completed PricewaterhouseCoopers review, the ministry responsible will be working with the fire chief and his senior management team to implement the National Occupational Standards, NOS, within the domestic division of the fire service, and these will be embedded within the job descriptions. Gaps in capacity and competence will be identified based on the prescribed standards and targeted training offered to officers who require it. Focus will also be placed in the development of a comprehensive promotion strategy with clear criteria for advancement. The ministry advises that the plan is to conduct open promotion boards for the roles of Deputy Chief Fire Officer, Senior Divisional Officer, and Divisional Officer by the end of the third quarter of 2018. As you will be aware, having had the benefit of expert consultancy advice, the ministry and the fire service are working to set out a clear plan of action for the way forward to develop a world-class fire service. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the continued scrutiny of members of this honorable House and of this community to ensure that we are building a world-class fire service with world-class opportunities for Caymanians to be advanced within the ranks. And the Deputy Governor and the ministry responsible invite the community to hold us to account that we make progress against this plan. At the same time, the ministry responsible will have internal support through the portfolio of the civil service and the leadership development programs that are part of the 5-year strategic plan for the civil service. Already, senior staff from the fire service have participated in the first leadership seminars, and I'm also pleased to advise that members of the fire service, 5 in fact, have successfully completed associate degrees through the Civil Service College, which includes qualifications specifically in leadership and management. We will be working to ensure that the ministry has a formal plan for ensuring that these new skills and qualifications are utilized and built upon as part of succession planning for the fire service. It is making significant strides, including recruiting staff who already possess degree specifications. So whereas the general entry level for this profession was generally quite low, meaning that quite a bit of investment in training had to be done, including academically, for persons to have reasonable prospects to hold senior leadership roles, we're seeing in more recent recruits persons who already are possessing academic qualifications that would allow them to be able to focus on their technical competencies and on acquiring management and leadership experience. So we will be coming alongside to see what opportunities exist, as we also have as a challenge within our overall civil service for being able to create fast streams where people demonstrate high potential. In closing, Mr. Speaker, it is an established fact that our current legislation, the Public Service Management Law, makes appropriate provision for ensuring suitably qualified Caymanians are given every opportunity and advantage to be appointed to civil service positions, including the critical roles of Chief Fire Officer and Chief Immigration Officer. It is true, Mr. Speaker, that we prioritize above all else that successful candidates must have the best balance of qualifications, skills, knowledge, and experience for the positions. In our journey towards a world-class civil service, we can expect no less. And in the two critical roles that are the focus of this motion, the price we would pay for ensuring that we have suitably qualified appointees in these critical positions, were we to fail, where safety and security are paramount, that price would simply be too high. I have also pointed out that in relation to the post of Chief Immigration Officer, which is also a very large role, that seeking to mandate that a Caymanian must fill this role is perhaps a case of legislating for a problem that does not exist. In the case of the Chief Fire Officer, I understand by the efforts made by the ministry to identify suitably qualified Caymanian candidates that there are significant strides being made. And I acknowledge the deficiency in succession planning, which has contributed to the current situation where there is not a pool of candidates immediately available to take up the role. And I've given commitments to ensure that the ministry takes the appropriate actions and that they are supported centrally by the POCS and the 5-year strategic plan to advance in that area. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we already have strong legislative support for promoting and hiring qualified Caymanians. Even if this proposed legislative change had been in place, it would not have remedied the challenges that prevented hiring a Caymanian in the last recruitment exercise. So, Mr. Speaker, the proposal would in one case be a solution without a problem, and in the other case is not an actual solution to the problem which exists. Mr. Speaker, and I know this raises a lot of debate, but I am bound to point out that the civil service is the responsibility of the governor, and it's delegated that responsibility to the deputy governor. And that is why the deputy governor has dual designations, namely deputy governor and head of the civil service. And the roles and responsibilities are prescribed by the Constitution and the Public Service Management Law. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, for the reasons that have been previously identified, not the least of which is our ultimate responsibility to safeguard the people of these islands and our borders, I cannot, and we cannot, recommend that this honorable House support the motion as it exists to mandate that the posts of the Cayman Islands Chief Fire Officer and Chief Immigration Officer be posts that could only be filled by Caymanians. But we can and have and will continue to ensure that we are providing the opportunities and that where persons are generally qualified, that preference is given to ensure that the tradition of filling these positions with Caymanians can continue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The member from Northside, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is always troubling when politicians have to resort to these kinds of motions, because the standard caveat is the civil service is the constitutional responsibility of the governor, who has delegated it to the deputy governor, and therefore we should have no say. However, it is us politicians who have to take the criticism and who have to go out and defend these unfortunate positions we find ourselves in, which oftentimes are no fault of the people sitting in these hollow chambers. But because the governor and the civil service have that cloak of armor and protection where the public has no access and no opportunity to criticize or punish them as they can do for politicians when the public believes that the politicians are not doing enough to make sure that Caymanians are getting opportunities. And, Mr. Speaker, while the opposition does not subscribe that what is proposed in the resolved section under the immigration law is a way to solve the problem, it at the very least gives the opportunity to hear what is being proposed by the civil service to address the matter. Because we believe that there is sufficient legislation already in place. We believe that in addition to the public service management law, there is provision in the public authorities law that says when two people are equally qualified and one of those persons is a Caymanian and one is not, the Caymanian must be given the opportunity. We subscribe on this side to the theory that the immigration law, which of course the governor and the government and the civil service decides, and the law does not require them to comply with the work permit provisions of the law. But the immigration law basically states, and the intent is that all jobs, every single job created in this country belongs to a Caymanian, unless, and then the law lays out a whole litany of things that has to be done to prove that you don't have a Caymanian to fill the job. There is no such requirement for appointments in the civil service. The public has no way of knowing what processes goes through other than they say an occasional ad in the paper. But mostly what us politicians have to listen to is the complaints of the civil servants who believes they are being passed over and the Caymanians who can't get in to the civil service. We promote succession planning. Myself and the member for East End have always advocated the removal of the section from the public service management law that requires people who are part of a succession plan, who act in a position repeatedly with good performance appraisals, because they're not told that the first time they act that you'll never get the opportunity again. Pretty good judgment of whether somebody did a good job acting for the person about them while they were gone is if they're offered the job to act the next time the post is vacant, well, through vacation or whatever. Because if the person did not perform well in the first chance, they shouldn't be given a second chance. But we hear all of this touting of succession planning. We have cases where people as deputy act for directors, act for chief officers. Then when the time comes to recruit that position, that person is told they've got to compete. And there has to be open competition. And they don't start off with any advantageous position, or the assessment of the people who are applying for the job does not appear to place any weight or additional points on the person who has successfully acted in that position. And the sad thing, Mr. Speaker, is that if we continue to talk about this global, this world-class civil service that we want, and we are going to force Caymanians to continue to compete with the world rather than with ourselves, there is always the likelihood that you will always find somebody else applying for the job who is more qualified or more experienced than the Caymanian. I have no problem with Caymanians competing with Caymanians. But when you tell me that they have to compete with the whole wide world, and when you see that some of the positions that people are being recruited for within the civil service, the person that is given the job over a Caymanian does not always have the specific, exact qualifications that the position was asked for. In the case specifically of the recruitment of the non-Caymanian Chief Fire Officer, again, the member for Eastern and myself questioned extensively that appointment in here in several finance committees. We were given the assurance that the biggest part of that person's mandate was to train a Caymanian to take the position. I believe that recruitment happened, according to the ad I have here, 15th of February 2015, 3 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, while we may say that the people within the fire service were lacking in certain academic qualifications to be trained up to be Chief Fire Officer, while they were not acting in the skills of fire detection and fire preventage and all that sort of stuff, there were Caymanians who applied for that position who had exceptional academic qualifications and exceptional performance in the service, years of service, including a law degree. No, sir. Well, I have a copy of the application. Well, we were told they didn't have academic qualifications, you know, right? The problem is, Mr. Speaker, from where I sit, is that we often find it easy to accommodate minor shortcomings of non-Caymanians to give them jobs, but we don't seem to be providing the extra opportunity for Caymanians who may have the capacity to be trained up. And we were told that one of the reasons, if I recall, I don't have the hands out in front of me, I'm speaking from memory, and at my age, that is sometimes not as trustworthy as it used to be, my own memory. But I think we were told that one of the reasons that specific person was recruited was because of their extensive experience and knowledge of training other fire officers. Question is, why are we now today, we don't have a Caymanian trained up? Because, Mr. Speaker, $175,000 sounds like a lot of money. But when you divide it by 50 offers, that's $3,500 per person. That don't buy a lot of training in this day and age. And while, Mr. Speaker, we recognize and we congratulate the civil service in the things that it is doing well, and the number of Caymanians that we have in high positions. That is well and good. And we congratulate the portfolio of the civil service and the deputy governor in particular for some of their recent, in the last 3 or 4 years, successes. And that bodes well for the plans for the civil service. But, Mr. Speaker, our concerns lie in the fact that, as I said earlier, while we hear a lot about succession planning, many civil servants who are given opportunities to act complain that when the time comes for them to be given the position that they have spent 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years training for, they suddenly find that there is an academic requirement added, like a law degree, which didn't exist before, which was not part of the competencies required for the predecessor. And we know how we have heard the civil service, probably incorrectly, but globally described historical in Cayman. 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had to be a member of United Church to get a job in the civil service. 80s, 90s, first part of the century, you had to be a qualified accountant. That was the most important qualification. Today, the most important qualification is the law degree. And one of the things that I would like to see the civil service do a little bit more is competencies and gap analysis. And the person who is acting in a position, if there is any shortcomings, there is a clear assessment of what the gaps are, and the person is allowed the opportunity to get and fill those gaps and get those qualifications. For example, in the fire service or in the immigration department. Because oh, I know, I got to add here. It is imperative that Caymanians feel that they are given every opportunity. And while we may have all of this best intentions in the world, we may have documentation. If we have one Caymanian in the civil service who feels that they are not given the opportunity and they don't know very clearly why and what their shortcomings is in terms of either academic qualifications or experience for that position, and they just feel that they're being passed over and they're used to fill gaps, because when the person goes on leave and they need someone in a hurry and they put them in, they got to run the show, they got to take all the crap, they don't have the expertise, they say. And then 2 years later, when we see somebody's brought from some other department or from overseas to put in a position, and the person who has been acting as, if you are part of a succession plan and you're acting in a position and you are being judged and measured against somebody else who has never acted in that position, you should start off with some additional points. But the response I get from those civil servants who are aggrieved is that they're beginning to feel that having acted, they're being put at a disadvantage, not at an advantage. And whether that is real or not, as long as it's a perception, we need to make the efforts to correct it. So, Mr. Speaker, we believe that some good things are being done in the civil service. We believe that when we have to go to this extreme and recruit an un-Caymanian, and undertakings are being given that that person is only being brought in for a special period of time, that all efforts are being done to train a Caymanian to take over that specified time. It was our understanding when the chief fire officer was hired that that should have taken about 2 years. So we're 1 year late. Right? Because if they did not have somebody who applied for the job, the government has had at least one, they should have had 1 year of appointing this person, identified the Caymanian who was capable of being trained and made sure they got the training. I made that clear, that the position I find myself in is that I am walking on thin ice, because I don't have the ability within these hollows to even criticize the government and her governor in her decisions or any, and I understand that the elected members of this honorable house have no authority other than what the Constitution provides, where you have administrative authority for the implementation of policy. Most of that is most likely confined that you have to work the person that they give you, not necessarily have an opportunity to select the person that you would like to work. And one of those things that I believe we need to address within the civil service is, in particular, the people who work with elected members of cabinet, in that they should have some authority and input into that decision as to who is going to manage their policies. Because, Mr. Speaker, I spent 4 years up there. I know how they operate. They look at you, yes, Mr. Minister, no problem. You go back 2 weeks later, there's that thing we talked about 2 weeks later. Mr. Minister, you sure you asked us about that? Right? So we find ourselves in this unfortunate position where we have to take the criticism from the public, because the public expects us to do something about it. More so the cabinet and even us. But in truth and in fact, there is very little you can do. Now, I didn't support Mr. Elio's motion, and because I don't believe we should spell out certain jobs are for Caymanians, because I believe what that says is that that's the only jobs Caymanians can do, and therefore these other jobs should never be allowed for Caymanians. My position is, and I would encourage the government to adopt this position, now I'm talking to the elected cabinet, that every job in the Cayman Islands belongs to a Caymanian unless somebody can prove that no Caymanian is available to fit that position. And the immigration law and the boards, and some of these boards need to tighten up their approval process and ask some questions. The government gives them the tools, the legislation to act with. We know when it was 3 years ago, Mr. Premier, you put in the fine for misinforming the board about Caymanian applicants. I don't believe a single person has been fined since that law was put in place, not to my knowledge. I find it hard to believe that not a single board during that period of time was not misinformed about some Caymanian applications. Which is why I encourage people who come to me when they're applying for jobs is to copy the application to the board. But again, that could be so overwhelming to the board that it gets lost anyway. So I don't believe that the answer is in us writing more legislation. I believe the answer lies in enforcement of current legislation and implementation and interpretation of existing legislation to the benefit of Caymanians. Because I believe that's where we're falling down. And I agree with the Honorable Deputy Governor about the importance of having a qualified person, of protecting and the security and all the stuff that goes along it, right? But that is not what the complaint is about the Caymanians why they weren't given the top managerial position. The shortfall by the Caymanians seems to be that they don't know enough about managing people, they don't know enough about budgets, they don't know enough about other things, other than saving lives and protecting our people. And another thing that the civil service needs to consider, if you bring in a non-Caymanian and place them in a position above a Caymanian in an organization, and the Caymanians start to ask questions to get learning from that person, it can become insubordination. And the Caymanian can be punished for aggravating the boss about things. If you do it the other way around, if you put the Caymanian in the top position, you bring in the expertise to fill in the gaps that they don't have. When the Caymanian asks that employee under him for the information, he got to be forthcoming with it. So it is greater opportunity to get knowledge transfer if we bring the expertise in to support the Caymanian, as opposed to bringing the person in above the Caymanian to train the Caymanian. Because as the Premier announced this morning in the formation of his tribunal, which I support, his commission, which I support, the belief by our forefathers in drafting immigration legislation and the Caymanian protection law, that people were going to come to this paradise from somewhere else and train Caymanians to hurry get back home, not working. Because, I don't know about anybody else, Mr. Speaker, but if you see Ezra Miller leave Cayman to go to work somewhere else, I go in there because Ezra can be better off, you know. Well, the community in which I go to work might get some benefit from me doing a good job, but I'm not there to benefit that community. As they try to tell us, they're here to benefit us. They are here because they're better off here than where they're coming from. Because only that one that thinks everything coming from downriver and floating is gold would migrate from a bad set of circumstances to a worse set of circumstances, or from a good set of circumstances to a bad set of circumstances on their own volition. Most of us migrate because we're going to improve our lot in life and that of our families. So when we're asking people to come here and they find out what a paradise this is, to ask them then to train a Caymanian in short order so they have to go back, ain't gonna happen. That's another thing that I don't understand. All of the Caymanians that I know who migrated for employment or education or other reasons had one ambition in life: come back to Cayman. If they didn't get back until they were dead, they always talked about coming back to Cayman. Somehow these people that come here don't want to go back where they was. What they want us to do and what they lobby us to do is to change the law for them to stay here forever. So, Mr. Speaker, I implore the portfolio of the civil service to continue and improve on what they're doing, because we have to ensure that the perception of Caymanians, particularly Caymanians who go in other jurisdictions and get higher education, compete against these same people in their jurisdiction, get better marks than them in school, and somehow they can come down here and get a better job than we can get in our own country. And there is a growing emotion in this country of young, educated Caymanians beginning to believe more and more that they are not being given the opportunity that they believe they should have in their own country. And as the leaders of the country, we have to do everything in our power to try and change that, to get back where it was in the 70s and 80s, where Caymanians believed that they could be successful in one country and succeeded. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe it is somewhat sad that a motion like this has to be brought to Parliament, but it does give the opportunity for members to vent their frustrations on behalf of their constituents. And I encourage the portfolio of the civil service, the deputy governor, and the governor to be more deliberate in their succession planning and to find ways to, in particular, ensure that the person who successfully performs in an acting role gets the opportunity for the job when it becomes vacant. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Crave the indulgence of members for a brief suspension. Please, we don't have to leave the chamber.